All right, so today we're diving deep into software testing environments. It's more than just clicking around and hoping for the best.
Right.
We've got our stack of articles and notes here, and honestly, it's way more interesting than I initially thought. Like it's setting the stage for performance, but for software.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
really is. A test environment is that behind-the-scenes space where you make sure your software can handle the spotlight before it goes live. It's not just about the code itself, it's the whole setup.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our sources mention things like hardware, networks, even specific data used for testing. Why is all that so crucial?
Think of it like this. Imagine opening a restaurant without a kitchen. You might have a beautiful dining room and a fantastic menu, but you can't serve food without the right tools and ingredients, right?
Makes sense.
A test environment is the kitchen where you prep your software to be served to the world. It's where you make sure it can handle the heat of real-world use.
So it's not enough to just write the code.
Yeah.
You have to create a whole ecosystem for it to run in.
Exactly. And that ecosystem has to be as close as possible to the real world. If you're testing a website, you need to make sure it works on different browsers, operating systems, and even internet speeds. You don't want users getting frustrated because the site loads slowly or looks different on their device.
Right. Our sources list a bunch of components that make up a test environment. System and applications, test data, database servers. It's like a recipe.
It is. And just like with a recipe, the quality of your ingredients matters. If you're using outdated software or a weak server for your testing, you're not going to get an accurate picture of how your software will perform in the real world.
Okay, speaking of ingredients, one that stood out to me was test data. It's like the script your software follows, right? But instead of lines, it's all the different inputs and scenarios you throw at it.
That's a great way to put it. Test data is like a dress rehearsal for your software. You want to make sure it can handle all the different scenarios it might encounter in the real world. For example, if you're building an e-commerce platform, you'll want test data that includes various product types, customer profiles, different payment methods, and even edge cases like out-of-stock items or discount codes.
Oh, that's interesting. You mentioned different browsers earlier. I know from personal experience that websites can look wildly different depending on what browser I'm using.
Yeah.
Why is that so important in testing?
Imagine this. You're launching an online store, and everything looks perfect in your browser. But then customers start complaining that the checkout button is missing or the images are broken. Turns out your website isn't compatible with certain browsers. Disaster, right?
Yeah, that would be bad.
That's why having different browsers in your test environment is so crucial. It helps you catch these compatibility issues early on and ensure a consistent user experience for everyone.
Okay, so we've got our ingredients for our test environment. How do we actually set the stage?
It's a step-by-step process, kind of like building a house. First, you lay the foundation with your test server. This gives your software its own dedicated space to run, just like you wouldn't build a house without a solid foundation.
Makes sense. Then what? What comes after setting up the test server?
Next, you tackle the network setup. This is all about making sure your software can handle the flow of information. Like plumbing and electricity bring essential services to your house. Think about things like internet access, local networks, and how your software communicates with the outside world. You need to ensure smooth communication and data transfer.
So you're not just throwing the software onto a computer and hoping for the best. It's about creating a whole infrastructure.
Exactly. You need to simulate the real-world conditions your software will be operating in.
Okay, that makes sense. Our sources mentioned a test bed, which sounds intriguing. What's the difference between that and a regular test environment?
Well, they're often used interchangeably. But a test bed can sometimes be a more specialized environment, like a high-tech lab specifically designed for testing new and potentially risky technologies. It's where you push the boundaries of your software and see how it performs under extreme conditions.
So it's like a proving ground for those cutting-edge features that need that extra layer of scrutiny before they're unleashed on the world.
Exactly. It's where you can really put your software through its paces without the risk of disrupting your live systems or exposing users to potential issues.
All right, that makes sense. So we've got the server, the network, and potentially a specialized test bed. What about the actual computers the testers will be using?
That's another critical piece of the puzzle. You need to equip your testers with the right tools, like different browsers for web testing or emulators and specific devices for mobile app testing. Think about it. A website might look perfect on a desktop computer, but be completely unusable on a smartphone. You need to catch those issues before they reach your users.
So it's about covering all your bases and making sure the software works seamlessly across different devices and platforms.
Precisely. It's about creating a testing environment that is as diverse and representative of your user base as possible.
Okay, this is all making a lot of sense. But I'm curious, once we've set up the environment, how do we actually put it to use? How do we start testing?
That's where the real fun begins. Testing is all about putting your software through a series of scenarios, like giving your actors a script to perform. But instead of lines, you're feeding it data inputs and actions to see how it
So
responds.
it's not just about checking if the software works. It's about seeing how it behaves under different circumstances.
Exactly. You want to understand how your software performs under pressure, how it handles errors, and how it responds to unexpected inputs. This is where you start to uncover those hidden bugs and glitches that might not be obvious at first glance.
Right, those edge cases.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
we're giving the software a script, putting it through its paces, seeing how it handles different scenarios. What kind of data are we talking about here?
Ideally, you want to use data that's as realistic as possible. Think about the information your software will be handling in the real world. Customer details, product information, financial transactions. You need to test with data that reflects that complexity.
Okay. Our sources mention using something called production data, basically real data from the live system. But that sounds risky. What about privacy concerns?
You're right. Using real user data for testing raises some serious ethical and legal questions. That's where techniques like anonymization come in. It's like changing the names and identifying details in a story based on real events. You preserve the essence of the data without compromising anyone's privacy.
So you're scrubbing out the sensitive stuff while still keeping the data realistic enough for testing purposes. Are there different approaches to anonymization?
Absolutely. One common technique is called blacklisting, where you essentially block out specific sensitive fields, like names or social security numbers, while leaving the rest of the data intact. Another approach is whitelisting, where you only keep a pre-approved list of fields that are considered safe for testing.
So blacklisting is like redacting a document, while whitelisting is more like creating a summary with only the essential non-sensitive information.
That's a great way to visualize it. The choice of technique depends on the type of data you're dealing with and the level of sensitivity involved. And of course, you need to make sure you're following all applicable data privacy regulations.
Right, of course. Okay, so we've built our environment, we've got our data, we're running our tests. But it seems like managing all of this could be a full-time job in itself.
You're absolutely right. Managing a test environment is an ongoing process. It's like tending a garden. You need to constantly water it, weed it,
Hmm.
and make sure it's getting enough sunlight. You can't just set it up and forget about it.
So what kind of tasks are involved in keeping this testing machine well-oiled?
One key aspect is maintaining a central repository, a sort of library where you store all the different versions of your test environments. You also need to manage access to these environments, ensuring that different teams can test their software without stepping on each other's toes. Imagine having multiple theater productions trying to rehearse on the same stage at the same time. Chaos.
Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. So it's about coordination, communication, making sure everyone's on the same page. What about things like monitoring and updates?
Absolutely crucial. You need to constantly monitor your test environments for any issues, keep the software and hardware updated, and troubleshoot any problems that arise. Think of it like a stage manager making sure the lights are working, the sound system is functioning, and the stage is safe for the performers.
Our sources highlight some challenges that teams often face when managing test environments.
Hmm.
Things like remote environments, elaborate setup times, and conflicts between teams trying to share resources.
These are real-world issues that can make testing a lot more complex. For example, imagine your development team is in one city and your testing team is spread across different time zones. Trying to coordinate testing schedules and communicate effectively can be a real headache.
That sounds like trying to direct a play with actors who are all rehearsing in different countries. How do you handle that kind of situation?
It requires a lot of clear communication, flexible scheduling, and reliance on tools like video conferencing and screen sharing. You need to be able to work asynchronously and make sure everyone has access to the information they need when they need it.
That makes sense. Another challenge mentioned is the combined usage between teams. What are the pitfalls there?
When multiple teams need to use the same test environment, you need to be very careful about scheduling and resource allocation. You don't want developers making changes to the environment while testers are trying to run their tests. That's like trying to paint a room while someone's trying to sleep in it. It's a recipe for frustration and inaccurate result.
So it's all about having clear protocols and communication channels to avoid those kinds of conflicts.
Exactly. You need a system in place for booking the test environment, managing different configurations, and tracking who's doing what. It's like a well-choreographed dance where everyone knows their steps and moves in harmony.
Our sources also talk about elaborate setup times being a major pain point.
Yeah.
What makes setting up these environments so time-consuming?
Think about it like this. You're not just setting up a single computer. You're creating a whole ecosystem that mirrors your production environment. This involves installing and configuring servers, databases, networks, and all sorts of software components. It's like building a complex stage set with multiple levels, moving parts, and intricate lighting.
And I imagine there's a lot of fine-tuning involved to make sure everything works perfectly together.
Absolutely. You might need to tweak network settings, configure user permissions, and even create custom scripts to automate certain tasks. It's a meticulous process that requires both technical expertise and a deep understanding of the software being tested.
So it sounds like having a dedicated team, or at least a designated person, to manage the test environment is crucial.
It's definitely not something you can just tack onto someone's existing responsibilities. A well-managed test environment requires dedicated time, attention, and specialized skills.
Okay, we've talked about the challenges. Let's dive into some best practices. What are some tips for creating a smooth and efficient testing process?
First and foremost, you need a solid plan. This involves defining your testing goals, identifying the resources you'll need, and outlining the roles and responsibilities of everyone involved. It's like creating a blueprint before you start building a house. You need to know what you're aiming for and have a roadmap to guide you.
So you're not just diving in head first. You're taking the time to strategize and map out the process. What about the tools themselves? Are there specific types of software that can help with test environment management?
Absolutely. There are tools for everything, from automating test scripts to managing virtual machines and tracking bugs. It's like having a whole toolkit at your disposal with each tool designed for a specific purpose.
I imagine documentation is also crucial in this kind of setup.
You're right, documentation is key. You need to document everything, from the hardware and software configurations to the network settings and user access permissions. Think of it like a detailed stage manager's notebook that outlines every aspect of the production. If something goes wrong, you need to be able to retrace your steps and understand how everything is connected.
Okay, so planning tools, documentation. Any other pearls of wisdom to share?
One important best practice is to keep your test environment as similar to your production environment as possible. This ensures that your testing is realistic and reflects the real-world conditions your software will be facing. You don't want to test a website designed for thousands of users on a server that can only handle a handful of connections.
So it's about creating a faithful replica of the real world within your testing environment. What about security? Is that a concern in a test environment?
Security is paramount. Your test environment should be just as secure as your production environment, if not more so. This means implementing appropriate security measures like firewalls, intrusion detection systems, and strict access controls. You don't want to expose sensitive data or create vulnerabilities that could be exploited by malicious actors.
It's like making sure the stage door is locked and guarded to prevent unauthorized access to the theater.
Exactly. And don't forget about automation. Automating repetitive tasks like setting up test data or running test scripts can free up your team to focus on more complex and creative aspects of testing. Think of it like having robot stagehands who can handle the heavy lifting and repetitive tasks, allowing your human crew to focus on the more nuanced aspects of the performance.
So automation is about working smarter, not harder. What about evaluating and improving the process itself?
Continuous improvement is key. You need to regularly gather feedback from your team, track key metrics, and identify areas where you can optimize your setup and workflows. It's like having a post-show debrief to discuss what went well and what could be improved for the next performance.
It's about treating the testing process as an ongoing evolution, constantly learning and adapting to new challenges and opportunities.
Precisely. By embracing a culture of continuous improvement, you can ensure that your test environment remains effective, efficient, and aligned with the evolving needs of your software development process.
This has been incredibly helpful. I'm starting to see why test environment management is such a critical part of building great software. It's not just about finding bugs, it's about ensuring quality, preventing disasters, and ultimately delivering a seamless and enjoyable experience for users.
Exactly. It's about building confidence in your software and knowing that it's been thoroughly vetted and prepared for the real world.
Before we wrap up part 2, I want to touch on one more point our sources make. They emphasize the importance of understanding the differences between the test and production systems, and how those differences might impact the validity of your testing.
That's a crucial point. Even with the most meticulous setup, there will always be subtle differences between your test environment and the real world. It's like building a perfect replica of a famous landmark. It might look identical from the outside, but the materials, the foundation, the internal structure will never be exactly the same.
So it's not just about creating a perfect replica, it's about understanding the limitations of that replica and interpreting your test results accordingly.
Exactly. You need to be aware of the potential discrepancies and factor those into your analysis. For example, if your test server is less powerful than your production server, you might need to adjust your performance expectations accordingly.
So it's about being realistic and understanding that testing, while incredibly valuable, is always going to be an approximation of the real world.
Precisely. It's about using your test environment as a powerful tool for learning, refining, and ultimately delivering the best possible product.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, one last question before we move on to part three. Our sources briefly mentioned the idea of reusing existing test setups for other projects. Is that a common practice?
It can be. If you have a test environment that's already set up and configured for a particular type of software or testing scenario, it might make sense to reuse it for other projects that have similar requirements. Think of it like repurposing a stage set for a different play that has a similar setting or theme.
So it's about being resourceful and leveraging existing assets to save time and effort.
Absolutely. But it's important to do it carefully. You need to make sure the existing setup is truly compatible with the new project's needs, and that you make any necessary adjustments to the configuration. You wouldn't want to try to stage a Shakespearean drama on a set designed for a lighthearted musical comedy.
That's a great analogy. It's about finding the right balance between efficiency and accuracy, making sure you're not sacrificing quality in the pursuit of speed.
Exactly. It's about making informed decisions and choosing the best approach for each specific situation.
So we've covered a ton of ground here, from the nuts and bolts of setting up a test environment to the strategic thinking behind managing it effectively. What stands out to you as the most crucial takeaway for anyone getting started with this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that testing is not an afterthought. It's not something you tack on at the end of the development process. It needs to be baked into the entire life cycle of your software. A well-designed test environment is like having a safety net for your development team. It gives you the confidence to experiment, to push the boundaries, knowing that you have a controlled space to catch any potential issues before they impact your users.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like having a dress rehearsal before opening night. You wouldn't want to unveil a new product or feature to the world without making sure it's ready for the spotlight, right?
Exactly. And a robust test environment allows you to simulate that spotlight, to recreate those real-world conditions as closely as possible, and to identify and address any potential hiccups before they become major headaches.
Our sources also touch on something called integration testing, which sounds pretty complex. What's that all about?
Integration testing is all about making sure that different parts of your software work together seamlessly. Imagine you're building a house. You wouldn't just construct the walls, the roof, and the plumbing separately and hope they all fit together perfectly in the end, would you?
Definitely not. I'd want to make sure everything connects and functions as a unified whole.
Exactly. And that's what integration testing is all about. It's about testing those connections, those interfaces between different modules or systems to ensure that data flows smoothly, processes are synchronized, and everything works in harmony.
So it's about testing the interactions between different parts of the software, rather than just testing each component in isolation.
Precisely. And this can be particularly challenging when you're dealing with software that integrates with external systems or services. Think about a mobile app that needs to connect to a cloud database or a website that integrates with a payment gateway. You need to test those connections thoroughly to make sure everything works as expected.
So it's like making sure the electrical wiring in your house is compatible with the appliances you want to plug in. You don't want to blow a fuse or start a fire just because you didn't test the connections properly.
That's a great analogy. And with software, the consequences of poor integration can be just as disastrous.
Yeah.
Data corruption system, crashes, security breaches, it's not something you want to take lightly.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground here. From the basic definition of a test environment to the complexities of integration testing and the importance of ongoing management. Any final words of wisdom for anyone embarking on this software testing journey?
I'd say the key is to embrace a mindset of continuous learning and improvement. The world of software development is constantly evolving with new technologies and methodologies emerging all the time. So stay curious, experiment with different tools and techniques, and never stop seeking ways to optimize your testing process.
That's great advice. And remember, building a great test environment is an investment in the quality and reliability of your software. It's a way to mitigate risk, build confidence, and ultimately deliver a better product to your users.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture of quality where testing is seen as an integral part of the development process. not just an afterthought.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of software testing environments. I feel like I've gained a whole new appreciation for the complexity and importance of this often overlooked aspect of software development.
It's been a pleasure exploring this topic with you. And remember, even if you're not a software developer, understanding the basics of testing can help you become a more informed and discerning user of technology. So next time you download a new app or visit a website, take a moment to appreciate the behind-the-scenes work that went into making sure it's a seamless and enjoyable experience for you.
It's a great point. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. We hope you've enjoyed the journey and learned something new along the way. Until next time.